afternoon, good evening from where you are. Thank you. I hand over to Anne.
Hello, everybody, and it's lovely to see you all and to keep seeing new faces popping onto the screen as we speak. My name's Anna Clark. I'm one of IACD's European directors. I'm based in the north of Ireland in a town called Magherafelt, and I'm also currently the president of IACD. So on behalf of the full board of directors, I'd like to welcome you all here today. I think we're going to find this extremely informative, full of insight, very useful information, and I'm really looking forward to it. And on behalf of everybody who is here, I'd just like to say thank you to particularly Anastasia and to Tony for organising and convening this session, and look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much. And I'm going to hand over now to Anastasia.
Thank you very, thank you very much, Anna, and thank you very much, Tony. Now, this session, we're setting out to take a slightly different approach. So there are probably lots of details about the UN that you won't hear about, but we hope that you hear the sort of things that will be useful for your connecting with the UN. And please feel free to put your questions in the chat and to engage with us as we go through the process. I'm very glad that my very good friend Taisuke Komatsu, who is the director for Geneva and for Europe of the International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism, has agreed to join me in making the short presentation that we're going to make in a while. And first of all, I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'm going to ask him to introduce himself, and then we're going to get going as rapidly as possible. It's great to see so many people here. It's great to see so many people from so many different time zones. And I want to thank you all very much for joining us and say that I hope that the afternoon, the next hour and a half, is of value to you. As I said, please feel free to engage in whatever way you can, as much as you can with the process. What we're going to do, I've been involved with IACD for a number of years, and I've also been involved with the United Nations for a number of years, like Tony, who works for UN Women. Most recently, I was chair of the treaty body, which is responsible for overseeing the convention, implementation of the Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. That's the third committee. And I remain involved also with UN Women as a member of the expert group on migration and other involvements too. I'm Irish, as you might be able to tell from my accent, and I'm delighted to have been able to greet so many of you when you came to the World Conference on Community Development, first WCDC, which took place in Maynooth in Ireland in 2018. I've been a community worker all my life, and alongside of that, but I like to put the community work first. So, Taisuke, would you very briefly introduce yourself, and then maybe we'll get the slides up and we'll get going. Where is he?
Thank you, Anastasia, and thank you for having me. So my name is Taisuke Komatsu from the International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism. It's called IMADA in acronym. I am the Geneva representative of the organization, and my work is mainly to support civil society organizations, including racialized groups, from the national level to engage with the UN human rights system, especially the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, where I had the pleasure to get to know Anastasia and start our collaboration. So I look forward to our discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Ty. And already, as you can see, we have someone who's well used to both engaging with the UN and helping others to engage. So please direct your questions to him more than to me. So can we have the slides maybe, and we'll get started. And Taisuke, I'm going to ask you to take some of them also, please, if you didn't mind. We thought we wouldn't bore you with prehistory like the League of Nations, which Ireland actually played a pretty prominent role in the 1930s, but that we'd actually start with the foundation of the United Nations itself. So maybe we can just keep going to the next slide. So it was part of the Second World War commitments, the Charter in 45 and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And I'm sure you probably all know all of this, but the UDHR is actually quite important for our engagement and for community work engagement with the UN, because it has within it the genesis of a number of the human rights instruments, and also the genesis of a number of the commitments that create the condition for us to want to be involved with it in the first place. Okay, can we keep going? Now, oh wait, now I think we've missed one there. Probably no harm. This is a little map. It's a rather complicated map, but Ty decided that people needed something that gave the whole system in its totality. And I think it's useful from that point of view. So basically, it shows you what the organs of the United Nations are. We thought we'd start with the organs with the United Nations. The United Nations has two main sites, really, Geneva and New York. And we thought we'd start with New York. So the principal instrument of the UN in New York is the General Assembly, which meets, as you will know, in particular in its main session in September of every year. For the last number of years, these have been sort of virtual. For last year, this was a virtual session, and I think it could easily be a virtual session this year, but we'd applied to Tony for advice about that. And associated with the General Assembly then are a number of programs and funds, like, for example, the UN Development Programme. And I'm conscious that someone asked a question about that and about how you relate to it. To be perfectly honest with you, the extent to which any of these things connect with people in the countries that they're in can be fairly limited. You know, the UN is fairly stretched budget-wise, and there isn't always a very direct set of individuals who do that sort of relating. Sometimes the material collected for reports is done by researchers who are commissioned to do it. And to be fair to them, they very often do a very good job, but there can be occasions when they don't do such a good job. And there are also a number of research and training entities and a number of other associated entities. And we're not going to talk about UN Women, because I think Tony would be able to add a few words about that a little bit later. There are then also some related organizations, including the World Trade Organization and the associated Bretton Woods entities and instruments. So it's interesting to connect back to an instrument that some of us may have actually ended up campaigning against on a number of occasions in the not so distant past, back to the UN and to instruments that were really established in order to promote progress globally. The second thing then is the Security Council. And the Security Council has 15 members. The next thing is the Economic and Social Council, which I usually call Committee number 3, but we'll come on to that in a minute, followed by the Secretariat, followed by the International Court of Justice, and the Trusteeship Council, which provides some of the money. So maybe we'll just keep going. You'll get all of these. So the General Assembly then has these committees associated with it, and you can see what they are there. In a way, sometimes I also think, in a sense, they're in an order of importance too. So disarmament and international comes first, and then economic and financial, and then only after that, social, humanitarian, and culture. Decolonization, a fourth. Now, the fifth one there can be a very important one actually as well. It's basically the Budgetary Committee. And all of the member states of the UN are members, or various member states of the UN are members of those committees where those decisions are made. Of course, in a sense, the Budgetary Committee is all very interesting in terms of the decisions that it's made. But if the US and Russia and China don't pay their dues, their decisions have to get remade in a hurry, 9 times out of 10. So there is a political context to this as well, and important to acknowledge that. Like, for example, during the Trump administration in the USA, there were significant problems with US contributions. And as you will recall, the US also withdrew at one stage from the WHO. So, Ty, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so very briefly, so currently the UN has 193 member states, so almost all countries, and the non-member states, the Holy See, the Vatican, and the State of Palestine. And just to give you some political oversight of the UN, so it's divided by regional groups in many occasions. So they have these 5 regional groups: African states, Asian states, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Caribbean, and Western Europe and other states. So other states includes countries like Canada, USA, Australia, New Zealand, even though they are not Western Europe. So you can see the post-colonial distribution of states. And then at the same time, it's important to know that in addition to those regional groups, there are political groups, which is not limited to regions. So non-aligned movements are those who didn't join this Cold War division. And then they have this organization of the Islamic Conference, which is chaired by Pakistan. And then actually yesterday or today, they submitted a request to the Human Rights Council to hold a special session on Israel and Palestine conflict. So these political groups also play a big role in the UN.
Security Council is an interesting one for us Irish at the moment, because Ireland somehow succeeded in getting elected to have a seat on the Security Council, and will actually be the president of the Security Council for the month of September. So a number of us are busy trying to make sure that they put the right things on the agenda and that they continue to do a bit of a push around Palestine, for example. So there are permanent members of the Security Council, which are China, France, Russia, UK, and the USA, and they have a veto. And that can be one of the big barriers to the UN making any progress on anything sometimes. And for example, the US used that veto last week to avoid a motion on a ceasefire in Palestine getting through. And then that was kind of reversed by Biden and some of the remarks that he made afterwards. It's actually the only UN organ that has power to make decisions that member states are obliged to implement. And that's very often why the permanent members veto things. How they got to be permanent members is, of course, another question. It's got a fair bit to do, to some extent, with the Second World War and the period after that. And then the non-permanent members are divided in the way that that's indicated there. Okay, next. So in New York then, and this is not by any manner or means a comprehensive account. In the meetings, the things that meet in New York, the Security Council meets in New York, obviously, and there are regular meetings, 3 or 4 times a week of that. The General Assembly meets in New York. There's the main meeting of the General Assembly in September, but then there are also ongoing committee meetings, including of the Economic and Social Council. There are then the Commission on the Status of Women, which is one of the oldest instruments of the UN in support of women's rights, meets every March for 3 weeks. And it brings together women's groups, member states in particular. It's an entity of member states really, as opposed to being an NGO entity, but it brings together women's groups from all over the world in order to bring forward agendas that are concerned with progressing women's rights. To tell you the truth, it's become a bit of a political football, and it has proven very difficult in the last number of years to make real progress. Although this year and for the last 2 or 3 years, Ireland chaired it for 2 years. So we managed to get everyone to agree to something. But I'd have to say, getting everybody to agree to something was what happened. And really, the progress for women in UN terms is now much more made. And again, we'll have to ask Tony to tell us a bit about that, is now much more made through the UN Women, the agency UN Women, which Tony works for, and also through CEDAW, which is the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which is actually the treaty body responsible for the implementation of that convention. And Tessa in particular, and also Laura, are going to talk about that. Okay. So the human rights system then, which is really to some extent based, which is more based in Geneva, consists of special procedures, which are basically special rapporteurs who have a commission to investigate or to look after a particular issue or to report on a particular country. So for example, there's a special rapporteur on extrajudicial killings, there's a special rapporteur on trafficking, there's a special rapporteur on racism, and they're all appointed for a period of 3 years, and then they can be reappointed again. How do you get that sort of a job? You apply yourself, indicating your interest, but the appointments are actually made by the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and therefore voted by the Human Rights Council. They have a selection process, all right. So it would be difficult enough sometimes for people to get those positions without the support of their particular country. The Human Rights Council, do we have a slide about the Human Rights Council, Ty, or do you want to say something about it?
No, we don't have a slide, so I can. Yeah. So the Human Rights Council is a part of General Assembly body technically, but it's in Geneva, and unlike General Assembly, its member states, the number of member states is limited to 47 states, and they are elected by vote in General Assembly. So it's a kind of a rotation within regional groups. So each regional group has a number of seats assigned to them, and they have 2 years term. And then after 2 years, they can continue for one more term. Then they have to wait for another year to be denominated again. But so they have 47 states, member states, and then other UN member states are observer states at the Human Rights Council, so they don't have voting rights, but they are still engaged in various discussions at the Human Rights Council. Over to you, Anastasia.
Okay, and then the big instrument of the Human Rights Council is something at the moment called the Universal Periodic Review, where each state presents a report reviewing all of its work in the various areas of human rights, and is reviewed by the diplomats from all of the other member states, or all of the others present at the Human Rights Council. And that's called the Universal Periodic Review. Because it's about countries reviewing one another, they all participate in it. And we'll talk about treaty bodies in a minute. The difference between them and that body, that review, and treaty bodies is that in this instance, it's diplomats and politicians maybe from the other countries who do the review, whereas in the case of treaty bodies, it's the 18 or whatever number of experts are on the committee that are responsible for the review, and I was one of those for CERD for a number of years. Universal Periodic Review is also a fairly important review because all of the countries actually participate in it. And for example, approximately every 3 years, each country is reviewed. And it is worth taking a look to see when your country is next due for review. The website of the Human Rights Council will actually be able to tell you those sorts of things, and we'll later supply a list of them. I don't remember when the US, you don't know, Ty, when the US is due for a review again, do you?
US was last year, so it's gonna be in the next 5 years. And
do you know can you tell us who's due for review this year besides Ireland?
I can write it down in the chat. I have the list.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much, because that might be interesting for people if they're in order to be able to make what you can do, what each country is obliged to do is they should actually consult NGOs in their country when they're putting together their report. Some do, some don't, in my experience of these things. But secondly, you can also submit a separate alternative report or shadow report to Geneva. They have a fairly strict word count for the Universal Periodic Review. If you're submitting a report on your own, you can do 2,500 words. And if you're submitting a report with any number of other organizations, you can do 4,000 words. And frequently there's a preference for joint reports for these sort of reviews. So that's one way as we go forward, that you can engage with the UN without being a member of anything. You can comment, or you can send an alternative report to a review by the UPR. Okay, so if we move on then fairly rapidly to treaty bodies. Ty, would you like to take this one, since this is your sort of area?
Yes, so treaty bodies are consisted of 10 bodies. And they are mandated to monitor the implementation of the human rights treaty they are in charge of. So like Convention on the Discrimination Against Women, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, Convention Against Torture, and so on. And in general, so there's a slight difference among treaty bodies, but states are required to submit the report every 4 years. And then treaty bodies meet in Geneva to review them, and they have an interactive discussion with states to examine their report. And then also civil society has the opportunity to submit alternative reports and also make intervention in Geneva to enrich the discussion during the interactive dialogue with the state and the committee. And I think I should stop here. Yes, sorry.
Okay, that's great. But that's another way that you can engage with the UN without being a particular delegate to anything. You know, you can actually, each country, when they're making a report, and Tessa and Laura will speak about that in terms of CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. When a country is making a report on that, again, they're supposed to include civil society in the making of the country report. But in addition to that, you can send an alternative report to Geneva for consideration as part of the documentation. A number of people also travel to Geneva for those considerations. There is a small fund, but it would be excessively difficult, I need to be very clear to you and say, for countries in the Northern Hemisphere to access funding from that, and rightly so. But there is a very small fund in support of Indigenous groups and minority groups from developing countries or from the Global South to be able to participate in Geneva. But with the pandemic and with a move now to more virtual reporting systems, that may no longer be a barrier, and it may become easier for NGOs to participate. Already some of the committees facilitate that, and for example at CERD and at CEDAW, it is possible sometimes for people to make their sort of representations over in the same way as we're over Zoom, in the same way as we're doing this today. So that's a second way where, without having to be explicitly a delegate, that countries can actually relate. But if you were going to go to Geneva, for example, for one of those examinations, you do have to make application to do so, and you do have to get cleared to do so, and you have to have a response from the secretariat of the committee that you're attending, as I'm sure Laura and Tessa will tell you as well. You know, so it's not just turn up at the gate in Geneva and say, I'm here because the Philippines is being reviewed today. You know, doesn't work that way. You've got to make you've got to apply well in advance, and then the committee secretariat has to acknowledge your application and say that they're happy to have you join. In effect, you could say there's some sort of a vetting process involved as well. Okay. And then we have we can keep going. There's also the Secretariat overall of the UN in New York, which is a very large entity with the Secretary General and with a number of a Deputy Secretary General and a number of Assistant Secretary Generals, including an Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights, who is actually a European woman that has been involved with this sort of work for many years, called Ilse Brancares from Latvia. So there are a number of assistant secretary generals, but in a way, there's a sort of a binary approach in the UN. And first of all, between human rights and the overall UN system itself, and security and defense and all of those matters, and economic progress as it's termed. And then secondly, there is also a tension about the role of civil society on an ongoing basis and the extent to which civil society is encouraged to engage. I mean, for example, as Ty could tell you about, CERD made sort of critical remarks about China, and the Chinese government were quite annoyed and sort of blamed both CERD and civil society because of the very correct criticism that was made of China. So a number of countries are very nervous of NGOs and tend to say that what NGOs will be talking about isn't objective, which seems to infer that what the country would be talking about is, of course, objective, you know, which is often, of course, the truth probably lies somewhere in the middle or more to the left than to the right. But that's how it's presented. And there is at the moment a particular antipathy to civil society coming from some states, especially Russia and the Chinese. Okay, civil society participation then. So we've talked already about civil society access to one-off events. And sometimes there are, for example, meetings hosted by the UN or by treaty bodies and other independent bodies. And you can usually attend those by virtue of making application in advance. The Minority Forum in Geneva would be one of them. So there can be then civil society access both in Geneva and in New York, and also for Vienna. And there are annual and temporary badges and one-off accreditation badges, and those can be applied for on an individual basis. But the main way that civil society participates on a sustained basis and do we have another slide that says that, or did we give up at that stage? The main way that civil society participates on a sustained basis is actually the next slide. I think we are here, sorry about that, is through consultative status with the Economic and Social Council and it's ECOSOC. So that requires a process of application, consideration by the committee of NGOs, and then a final decision. And for example, IACD would have that sort of status at the UN, as would IMADER have that sort of status at the UN. And then countries or organizations that have that sort of status are allowed to have a number of delegates who, after a process of going crazy for a while, manage to get annual badges. In other words, it can be very difficult to get the badges either in New York or in Geneva, or to follow the systems that are telling you how to get them. You get a number of annual badges whereby people can participate on an ongoing basis. Ty, you might like to say something about that, and I think we're nearly finished then.
Yes, can you go back to the previous slide?
Yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to also add that there's a difference between the meetings hosted by the UN and the ones hosted by independent experts. So the meetings hosted by the UN have to follow the UN protocols. So only NGOs with ECOSOC consultative status can be accredited. But the meeting hosted by independent experts are different because they're independent. So anyone can be accredited after application. So that's the main difference. And also another thing is traditionally Geneva has greater civil society access compared to New York. So normally in meetings in Geneva, there's a component of civil society space that the NGOs can make interventions, which is not often the case in New York. And then please go to the next slide. And also just to add about this consideration by the Committee on NGOs, so it's composed of 9 member states, and unfortunately it's always sat by, not all, but there are always some NGO unfriendly states in the member. And if you are very effective in your advocacy and criticizing states, it might be harder for you to get ECOSOC consultative status. So that's a dilemma there. And New York-based NGOs are advocating against that practice. Yes, over to you, Anastasia.
Thanks, Ty. Have we another one there? Because I think we're almost finished, aren't we? I mean, in a sense, I think multilateral direct engagement, multilateral engagement, documentation, consultation, and then in-country engagement. And I suppose in a sense, what I wanted to say about that is that there is direct engagement where individual organizations can engage. But if you're looking at ongoing engagement of the nature that IACD would hope to be more involved in, then in the same way as the multilateral system is organized around groups, and for example, countries in Western Europe belong to the Western European and Others group, which, as Ty was explaining, is not Western European, but is a lot of others, contains a lot of others as well. You know, NGOs organize themselves similarly, you know, so it's not just about one NGO with consultative status turning up at one meeting at the UN and expecting to be able to influence things. There are a number of standing groups and standing caucuses of organizations. There are standing caucuses that are, for example, associated with the high-level political forum. There is an NGO group associated with the Commission on the Status of Women. There's the UN Migration Network, and you were talking to me earlier, Ty, about the anti-racism network as well. So there are, well, no, actually those are UN entities, but there are standing groups of NGOs, which are the means by which civil society actually begins to make an impact. So in order to make an impact, one also needs to be part of one of those groups of NGOs and being associated with them and getting them to support one with the sort of things that you're beginning to move forward. That's very explicitly the case in New York. It can be a good deal less the case in Geneva, where certainly individual NGOs have a much better chance of beginning to make an impact on the human rights issues of the day. Okay, I think that's nearly, we have, there are a few indications there of the different things that are coming up. The Human Rights Council meets three times in the year, and they have a variety of working groups. The list of treaty bodies is there, and those are the committees responsible for overseeing implementation of the various human rights treaties that countries have signed up to. And then in New York, you have the General Assembly, the Third Committee, and the Economic and Social Council. Okay, and then current issues, Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll be talking about those, Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, and two other important compacts at the moment are the Global Compact on Migration and the Global Compact on Refugees.
Okay, so thank you, massive thank you to Stasia and to Ty and to Tony for their input into that. Can everyone give them a round of applause or some kind of emoji to say thank you for that incredible presentation? We realise that that's quite a lot for people to take in over such a short time, and we've got a couple of minutes for questions which have already come in through the chat and from members beforehand, before we pass on to the incredible Tessa and Laura to give us a real life example of how NGOs and community development organisations have actually used the UN instruments. So a couple of questions, Stasia and Ty, keep your answers short and I'll keep the questions short. So a couple of things that have come in is, are there UN staff based in every member state?
Not essentially, no. It depends on the member state. No, not essentially.
Okay, to what extent do the 6 committees collaborate on cross-cutting issues that arise? For example, poverty arising from severe economic recession or civil rights violations as a result of war?
Now, I'm going to give my answer, and Ty will probably give a much more diplomatic answer. I would say not enough gets to be the answer to that. Technically, they're supposed to collaborate and cooperate. And over the last number of years in New York, very specific cross-cutting sort of, and Tony, maybe you would come in on this one, especially for New York, very specific cross-cutting attempts have been made. For example, and again, Tony, I'd ask you to comment on this, they're supposed to look at the intersectionality with regard to women quite specifically, but I'm not at all convinced that that works as well as it should. And there can very often be a dominant committee whose perspective may prevail.
Well, I'll just say one or two words. Was the question for the different UN agencies or for the different treaty bodies?
It said for the committees collaborating, so I guess the different treaty bodies, I would expect.
Yeah, but I think it would also depend that different UN treaty bodies or different agencies have different mandates.
Yeah.
Some override the other, and there are issues like budgetary issues, membership and composition to these bodies, and the interests of the respective bodies, and influenced by member states is always a problem for the different UN agencies at times. So there is infighting, like Anastasia said, sometimes, but there should be interagency cooperation, and it's highly recommended. Yeah, Ty, you go.
I think you guys fully answered the question.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions coming through the chat. Stasia?
Anna asked a question there about how would you find out which organizations in your country are accredited. Now, no organization in anyone's country would probably be accredited, gets to be the answer to that. It's more likely, unless it was a very large one. And technically, and Ty, you're going to have to remind me of this, for an organization to be accredited and have status, normally they have to be operating in 2 or 3 or 4 different countries, you know, so it's unlikely to be a local national organization. Now, some large organizations, I see Randy Adams there, like the one that you were associated with, for example, over the years, did have status, but although a US, what was the name of the organization you were associated with, Randy? Why is my brain gone so bad at the minute?
The National Peace Corps Association.
Yeah. So, but the Peace Corps did have branches or did have associates in a number of other countries as well. So I think that might have facilitated it. But normally, an organization with status at the UN has to have members in a number of different countries. It's like it's a regional or international organization. Ty, can you add a bit to that maybe?
Yeah, so I actually share the database that the people can search which NGOs have consultative status. It's a UN database. And in addition to what Anastasia said, that let's say it's hard to get consultative status, but it's easy to keep it. So the renewing process is very easy, and you might find it surprising that some of the NGO you never heard of in your country have consultative status, and maybe they got it 20 years ago, and they became kind of a ghost NGOs, but they can still keep it. So you can look at the list and then find out which NGOs have the consultative status.
Okay, thanks for that. We've got a final question there, which is how will the ongoing reform oops, it's just moved on my screen when someone else put in a chat there. How will the ongoing reform in the UN system enhance engagement with civil society?
My answer to that was that depends on how the ongoing reform pans out. I mean, civil society is fighting hard to ensure that it doesn't push the UN further away from civil society. But as I said, the climate at the moment is not very favorable to multilateral diplomacy anyway, given the Security Council couldn't agree on a ceasefire resolution for Palestine last week. But and it's certainly not very favorably disposed to civil society. But I think that civil society is managing quite well, and in New York, it is more difficult. In Geneva, it's not quite so difficult. I think the jury is out on that one. There's no point in pretending that we know. The thing I would say overall about the UN is that it's not perfect by any manner of means. It's subject to the global political vicissitudes of the day, and we know what they're like at the moment. They can be difficult, but we do have some moments of opportunity as well, I feel just now. And some of that is up to the effort that's put into reshaping civil society engagement. And sometimes as well, to be perfectly honest, and I say this as someone who's engaged on behalf of and with civil society at the UN for years, it's also down to how civil society manages that space, you know, because you can't guarantee an outcome, and it's like anything else. If we get involved in it, we've got to be ready to negotiate, and we've got to be ready to see what we're prepared to compromise on and what's the best thing that we can do on the day in order to make progress in community terms and in human rights terms. And finally, given that we're talking here as part of the International Association for Community Development, I have to say to you that there isn't a lot of what people talk about at the UN is empowerment. A lot of what people talk about when they talk about poverty and when they talk about marginalization and racism is empowerment and empowering people and participation and all of those things. But actually the processes that might make those possible aren't always put in place, nor are they understood. Sometimes it's simply that they're not understood, and sometimes it's quite simply that they're not wanted. And I feel that we have a big job to do to get community development renamed in UN terms. It was named in the 1950s, but it was named very much just as some sort of process of support, of collaboration, as you will remember that old definition, between the state and the people, whereas maybe the community development process that a lot of us are involved in now globally are much more about sort of change and critique and creating the conditions where participation is acknowledged on those terms. And of course, that's exactly what some countries don't want from NGOs. And indeed, it's very much what those of us who are involved with the UN are trying to push as the real role of civil society, as holding a mirror up to what those who set out to represent us are doing there.
Great, thanks again to Tony and Stasia and Ty for your answers to that. I know there are some other questions that have come in, and we'll have a chance later on to pick up some of those. But so big round of applause again to you for your input. What we're going to hear now from Tessa and Laura, who are leaders of the Pavy Point National and Regional work in Ireland on domestic violence and traveller and Roma women's rights. And they've been leading on engagement with the UN for Pavy Point in relation to CEDAW. So I'm going to pass you over to those two to have the floor and tell us about your experiences. On you go.
Thank you, Claire. So first, I just want to thank people for this invite, and I'm delighted to be speaking here to everybody. And I just want to talk to my experience of being a traveller woman and going over to the United Nations to speak to CEDAW committee. So firstly, I'm going to give a very short input. And in my input, I'm going to cover looking at our experience of engaging with the human rights monitoring body at a UN level, and how important that was. The example I'm going to use is when we engage with United Nations CEDAW committee. And just to talk you through what we did and what value this had on my work and on my community and women in Ireland. So firstly, just to say how we engage with the United Human Rights Monitoring. It's an international human rights monitoring like CEDAW are so important tools to use to put pressure on the Irish state to act on traveller and Roma women's issues. It's very important. And also then we use the concluding observations and recommendations by the UN rights monitoring bodies when lobbying the state and state agencies to take action. So really put pressure on the Irish state. And as Stasia said before, there's a big lead up. It's not just like just going over to Geneva or to a committee. As an organisation and as a community, you have to prep, and prep is so important. So first what we did, we made a submission to the pre-sessional working group of the committee to make sure that traveller and Roma women were included in a list of issues Ireland was asked to provide more information about. This was very important to get traveller women on the agenda for the hearing in Geneva. Also what we did, we produced a shadow report to the committee together with another national traveller organisation, which is known as the National Traveller Women's Forum, and also to make sure that the committee was sent information about key issues impacting traveller women in Ireland. We also had a sense of solidarity with other NGOs in Ireland, and we fed into a joint shadow report with other NGOs. So even though we worked amongst ourselves within the traveller organisations, we also worked with other NGOs as well, which was very important. So just to say it as well, we've done a lot of preparation which took place before we actually travelled, and prep is a key for everybody in the situation. So what we did, obviously, we studied committee members, we got to know their interest, to see were they interested within travellers, within traveller rights, within women's rights, with gender equality. We also got to know who was the country rapporteur, which committee members are examining Ireland. That was very important for us. We also put a lot of work, myself and especially Laura and Pavy Point, put a lot of work in preparing briefing papers so we could give them and hand them out to committee members. And then we also worked with other NGOs who planned and how to get obviously to Geneva, but also when we were in Geneva, the importance of keeping working together. I suppose as well, when it came to the stage of getting to Geneva and at the actual hearing, so there was two separate events that happened. So one was an oral statement that myself and other NGOs took part in, and we had to time ourselves out. So I think we got about a minute. So there was a lot to compile within a minute to the committee members. And within that oral statement, we also had questions and answers. We are also then prepared a lunch briefing to some of the committee members. And again, we worked with other NGOs to make sure that each person got their chance to say what they needed to say, and everybody got their piece. So again, it was working together, it was planning, and it was also working in solidarity. Just to say as well, at the main event, CEDA and the Irish State had their own official meeting. We were allowed to observe and listen at that meeting. But when the hearing was over, then in between that, we were allowed to lobby to committee members, and we were allowed to speak to them during breaks, during lunchtime, and maybe have discussion with them to say what we have heard and to see will the committee members challenge the state. So it was a lot of hard work and it was a lot of hard going. Just go to the other thing here now, a moment. I suppose just to come to the end of what all the work that we did in Geneva, it didn't mean that it was really over. I suppose the hardest part might be over, but we knew when we had to come back to Ireland as well, there was a lot more hard work to be done. So coming back then, we were delighted that within CEDA, that there was a lot of our recommendations was listened to, a lot of our issues and concerns. So I'll just give you some 3 examples that we used to lobby to our own government when we came back to Ireland. So we thought one was very important, was around data collection on gender and ethnicity. And that was involved in the National Strategy on Domestic and Sexual and Gender-Based Violence. So that got a piece into that as well, which was very important. The biggest achievement of all, and it was even mentioned at CEDA, was being recognised as an ethnic minority group. So a recognition of ethnicity, and it happened in Ireland on the 1st of March 2017. And that was a big build-up and a big achievement for me and my community. Another big achievement was there was an inclusion of Traveller and Roma women in the National Strategy for Women and Girls, but it was also implemented and monitored, and a plan was put in place. But just to end my short input, I just think for people from NGOs and coming from a community myself where we face racism and discrimination mostly every day, one, it was a big achievement for me to go to Geneva, to stand up at very high people, I would say, and to come from myself. But there was a lot of planning put in place. There was a lot of support put in place. The fact that we had Stacia in the position that she was in and gave us direction and support was a key element. But also the advice I would give is to make a plan that is strategic, make your key ask realistic. So what you're asking makes effect for your community and for your country. As I said earlier on, it's important that you prepare. That is so important. And then also, when the recommendations are used, use the concluding observations as well. So just that's very short input from my experience of going to Geneva and speaking to CEDA committee, which was a great experience and it was a great honour. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Tessa. I think if we could all come off mute for a moment and just give it a big cheer, because I found that incredible. That was really brilliant. Well done, Tessa, on your achievements and taking those issues forward. Really, really incredible. Thank you. And thanks to Laura as well, who contributed to the presentation but didn't say anything today. That was really fab. We're going to now go into breakout rooms, and we have around 20 minutes for those breakout rooms. And in the breakout rooms, we really want you to just think about 3 questions, and I've put them there in the chat. It's, why are you interested in knowing about the UN? How would you hope to engage with the UN? and what outstanding questions and gaps in knowledge do you have? Because we're hoping after this session that we can pull some information together for our members and put on our website, which you can then draw from, and that will really help us to shape some of that. So I'm just going to check with Meredith that we're all good to be moving into our wee breakout rooms. Are we there?
We're all good. So I'm going to just open up the rooms now and you'll be able to join them.
Okay, and if you've got any problems with that, just message Meredith when you get into your room. Okay.
Is anybody having any trouble getting into their breakout room? Okay, so I'm still here. So if anybody's having any trouble getting into your breakout room, just let me know.
So I'll leave our bit to the end, and if I forget, please somebody from my group remind me. So what we hoped that you would all do is each group maybe have somebody who will feed back one key point or comment from your discussion, or an outstanding remaining question or gap in knowledge that's been highlighted through the discussion. So we haven't really got time for a thorough overview of everything that you talked about. I am going to have to ask you to keep it very succinct. So one reflection or comment or one question that's outstanding. And if there are other points that you'd like to make, please use the chat so that we don't lose them. And again, can I just remind everybody to stay on mute unless you're actually talking, just to keep the background noise down to a minimum. Okay, so group one, who was group one, Mayor, and who might we be calling upon to hear from? Oh no, you won't necessarily know now. We've all come out of the groups, will you?
Okay, so group one was Anastasia, Colin, Georgina, Jaya, Karen, Mario.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay, Karen is going to speak.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So I'll try to be succinct. We found it a really informative session, and thank you for all the good information. We are particularly excited about an opportunity or an idea for a greater recognition of community development at UN, and this we feel is extremely important, particularly around the UN system's current talk about localization of the SDG agenda, the 2030 agenda, and the role of decentralized governments within that. And so we think community development and civil society deserves a strong recognition within that. But we do understand this is extremely hard work, but we think it's a job for all of us who are interested to get involved in, and something that that IACD as a network, as a coalition, is extremely well placed to lead on. And many members would, so I think there are a number of members who would be happy to get engaged and work hard alongside the membership in this.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Karen. And we can come back to sort of pick up on some of these afterwards, but we'll hear from everyone first. So group two, I think
Group
that
two
might
is
be
you. That's you, Anna.
Yeah, okay. I'll leave that for now and we'll move on and hear from the other groups. So group three.
That was chaired by Claire.
Okay, so Claire or someone from that group, would you like to feedback?
I think it's me, and we had a really great discussion actually. And one of the questions that was kind of coming out was with COVID though, and the difficulties that people and communities are experiencing with COVID. How is the UN going to ensure that member states aren't falling behind with the SDGs and how they're actually being delivered? Because we're looking at really quite strong regressions there, and how can the UN ensure that that isn't happening for states as well as then by extension for communities and NGOs.
Okay. Right, that's great. So we've got some proposals from the first group and some questions from group 3. And I hope our UN representatives here are kind of paying attention to the questions. So we'll come back to some of those. Group 4, who was group 4?
Group 4 was chaired by Tony.
Okay,
Brilliant.
so
Tony.
I will speak for that group. I had a very diverse group, and it's important that I make mention. I had mainly from the Global South. I had someone from India, someone from Ghana, someone from Liberia, and I think the rest from Europe or so. So I first posed, at the end of our discussion, I posed the question, how have they been able to cope with the COVID pandemic? And what has been the role of community development or community practitioners? Because I was very keen to hear from the Indian perspective, especially that Anita Paul has been a long-serving board member and highly experienced. So I wanted to see the experience from the Liberian story, the Ghanaian story, and the Indian story. So that was a very interesting input. Of course, there was a big input, especially on speaking about the lack of funding and also of community development practitioners or civil society acting as a bridge, if I would take the Indian example, between the communities and the government. So as a go-between, but even as acting as a go-between, I was told the need is still high and the demands are still high and they are overstretched. The other issue which was raised, I think, by one of the participants from Ghana was about community development, or about the United Nations engaging at different layers, not only at the central government level, but at the local government level, and also engaging with grassroots organizations, because that's where the work with the communities is. So I found that very interesting, much as we have the global participation, but we should also come down to the local level. One main question which we didn't answer was, how can we, especially as IACD, engage further with the UN or engage more constructively with the UN? So I said we'll raise that question into the bigger group. Well, that's a point for further reflection. Thank you very much. Unless anyone from the group has any further input. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Okay, so we'll hear from the final group then, group 5. Is that the final group? How many groups were there?
Yeah, so there's 5, and then Chloe shared that one, and then we'll just go back to your group.
That's no problem.
I popped a couple of notes in the chat, and we had some really interesting discussions. And we had some people from Ukraine, the UK, Africa, and Ireland in our group. And we talked about connections, and I suppose real connections with real people, and how maybe a UN project can support a community or focus a community and strengthen their issue. Looking at the assets and abilities in communities and moving from feeling like outsiders to insiders, connecting with solidarity and dignity and respect, moving from being passive participants to active citizens. It will be lots of hard work. In Tessa's case, it could take over 2 years. You really need to be persistent and keep going. Work on lobbying and trying to get to know people who can help you get your foot in the door, to reach out. They're just some of the ideas, and not, I suppose, to feel intimidated by the UN as an organisation, and to use it as best as possible with your organisation.
Okay, thank you very much, Chloe. And I mean, this is great because I'm getting a sense of there's a lot of energy and a lot of interest around engaging with the United Nations from this group of people here. And that's really, really positive to hear. Just in terms of group 2, we had a great conversation as well, and talked around a lot of things prompted by the questions. A couple of really good points that came out. One was, and it picks up on something somebody said, the role that the rapporteurs play when they come out into communities. In Northern Ireland, particularly, one of our colleagues from Belfast was highlighting a particular report that had been done recently around the benefits system and the negative impact of that on local communities. And that rapporteur made a point specifically of going to talk to what they referred to as the experts, in other words, the people in the communities that were affected by poverty and by disadvantage. And that report that they did reflected those people's experiences. And that was very gratifying, is not probably the right word, but a really affirmative thing for people in those communities to see and to hear. And it linked with what Tessa had been talking about as well, in terms of then being able to use that to support continued discussion and dialogue around trying to change things for the better. And the other thing that came out of our conversation that was really positive was around a suggestion, very practically, about help to actually understand how to navigate the UN's website, because it was quite opaque was the word that was used. It's a big engine and there's a lot there. And how do you begin to kind of navigate your way around if you're not overly familiar? So that might be like another bit of a 101 session as well. So we've had some really fantastic conversations and some very informative feedback there that I think has been helpful to hear. Anastasia and Tony and maybe Tessa as well, and Ty, I don't know if you've heard anything in that feedback that you maybe want to just come back on at all in terms of the odd question or some of those suggestions. I can see Tessa's waving her hand, so we'll go straight to you, Tessa.
I suppose just for me in my breakout room, I heard from a lot of other communities, like how do you make the connection to the United Nations? Like there is challenges. But as I kind of brought into the room, it's a lot of preparation. There is challenges there, but there is support. And there's one key issue as well, is kind of working together in solidarity. Like I come from the travel community, but we made connections with other NGOs that was going over to CEDAR, to the United Nations Committee. So even you get a sense when you go over there, even though you're coming from Ireland, you're also working with other countries. And these other countries, when they start speaking, for instance, around racism and discrimination against women, we could feel a sense as well of solidarity. And I suppose my advice to other countries who find it very challenging to kind of get to that stage, don't give up, keep at it and keep up the work. Like, and even in community development, because you're doing it for a reason, you're doing it for your people, you want to see changes, you want to get rid of discrimination, and you also want to get rid of racism. And that's the way you're only going to do it. You have to keep fighting and you have to keep talking.
Brilliant, thank you very, very much.
Anna, I was going to suggest that it might be possible to get a comment from Laura if she's still here, but she may have had to go.
Laura, are you still with us?
Yeah, no, she had to go because she had something else on.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Anastasia, maybe yourself and Tony or Ty would like to come back on any of the points that have come up in the plenary. You're on mute.
Just very briefly then, a couple of things. I think this sanity check to begin with, engaging with the United Nations needs to be about engaging with the United Nations. You know, it's not about engaging with the United Nations just for the sake of engaging. It needs to be about engaging for a reason. You know, so if you're engaging on behalf of an organization, or you need to have a cause, you need to have a reason to go, a reason. I need to switch off that phone, obviously. You need to have a reason to be engaged. It's much more difficult to just find out, how do I actually find out how this works? If you have a reason to find out, if you're representing an organization, if you're bringing an issue, if you're doing something. Secondly, as regards the role of rapporteurs, it does depend on the rapporteur. That was the report you were talking about, Anna, that Philip Alston did before he stopped being rapporteur on extreme poverty on the UK, you know, and it does depend. You need to look up who is the rapporteur on different issues. And extreme poverty, the extreme poverty rapporteur is often a really important one. I think it's Oliver de Schutter at the moment, is often an extremely important, it is, you're nodding your head, it's often an extremely important one for community workers or people involved in community development. Thirdly, people asked about the SDGs and falling behind. Look, the only thing in the UN that has demand power is the Security Council. And as I was indicating earlier, it's very hard to get them to make those demands. So the SDGs were deliberately constructed, not as human, so that they didn't have the reinforcement of being directly associated with human rights treaties, but they are very important. And the extent to which they won't fall behind, because fall behind they will over the next period, unless civil society pushes, you know. So it's not about what you can get from the UN, it's about what you can put into the UN. And for example, the high-level political forum is coming up in July. Every country has signed up to the SDGs. All of them will be going along, jumping up and down and ticking little boxes and saying how wonderful they're doing and everything, but none of them are doing very well on anything, particularly the countries in the global north. So you need to find out what your country is reporting. You know, there will be a caucus of some sort in every country now, leading on reporting to the SDGs. You need to find out what your country intends to do, what they intend to say, and push something push something at them, I would say, in the same way as I need to find the off button on that phone. So Ty, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just quickly, I really sympathize with someone who said the UN websites are really not accessible in a polite way. And I often say to my former intern that you can write in your CV that you know how to navigate the UN website. I would say, in terms of the access to information, maybe it's easier to just Google it, and then it directly brings you to the information you are looking for, rather than starting from the entry page of the UN. And I will copy. Oh, sorry, I will put the link to the civil society publications for civil society prepared by the UN. So I think you can also read it to find out more on how to access each of the mechanisms. And also, like, if you need any particular information, you can ask us or somebody who are familiar with the UN. So that's more easier.
Okay, thank you, Ty. That's very helpful as well. And I'm conscious just that there have been some suggestions that have come into the plenary in relation to IACD. And we will, as the directors who are here today, we will take the conversation that has come out of today back and review some of those suggestions and ideas and questions in order to think about how we might be able to work with and support members around some of those suggestions. Again, taking on board Anastasia's point, which is always very well made, about being absolutely realistic and only thinking about what's manageable and doable. So thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to hand back now to Anastasia and Tony to begin to wrap up for this afternoon.
Tony, would you like to go first? I don't see you though. I do.
Okay, here I am. Thank you everyone for taking part in this workshop. Just 2 quick points. There are 2 events I always find very important every year. That is the CSW, which we organize as UN Women every year. And there is always a big possibility for civil society to participate and be heard. And especially community development, because we work lots with women's group, but also with groups involving all kinds of people from the grassroots. So the CSW gives you an opportunity to have your voice heard and to bring engagement through UN Women to the higher UN agencies. The High Level Political Forum as well, which will take place from the 6th to the 15th of July, 2021. So you can check the website and register to participate virtually. Just a few concluding remarks. I also gave this point in our group. After 10 years with the UN, I noticed there is the voice of community development is being silenced, or is being pushed to the end. So it's very important, and I agree with this. We've had this conversation with Anastasia again and again. So it's very important that we keep speaking, we keep engaging, especially as IACD, because we have the opportunity to engage with the UN in Geneva and New York. So it's important that we do not let our voices get suffocated. And this we can do through writing and also by engaging in different UN events. Thank you very much. And lastly, it was very happy to see Randy Adams, who got me into IACD in 2012. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Tony. I just want to add my words of thanks to everybody. It's great to see so many people here, so many older friends and so many new faces. I think between us, we can all make a difference. As I said at the outset, I think that I'm delighted that people are interested in making community work and community development more visible at the UN. It will be an uphill battle, but the way we do it is the way we've done our work always, which is by starting where we're at. We need to make community development visible where we're at to begin with. And if it's not visible where we're at, it's going to be mighty hard to make it visible anywhere else. So I think that, and then building on that, I do believe that between us, it's possible to use those sorts of skills and those sorts of methods to make waves elsewhere too. But to be clear about what we want, why we want to do it, and what we want to do it about, and to try to build from there. And I really look forward to working with you all towards that end. I mean, I think that we're faced with a very difficult context globally, but we do have instruments that can at least hold back the tide for a while. And there is the upcoming Glasgow event towards the end of the year, which is based right where Claire is living. So some of us had hoped we might get there, but we might be looking at it on a screen still, and there are a number of other things coming up too. So Goramila Mahagav Galer in my own language. Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the very tolerant colleagues that myself and Tony have in IACD who have supported us to organise this. So particular thanks to Mir and to all of the work that you've done, Meredith, to create the conditions for it. And particular thanks to Chloe at an earlier stage when Mir was sick for helping us to get the notes out. And thanks especially then to Tessa and to Laura for their very useful input, and very, very special thanks to Taisuke for coming to the rescue one more time and being so helpful. And I know, Taisuke, that we can rely on you to provide some of that materials that people were asking for. And I know Tony will be supplying a number of other materials as well. So thank you all very much, and have a good morning, a good afternoon, a good evening, or a good night.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye. Stay safe.
Great session.
Bye. Thank you. Keep well, keep safe.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Don't forget to check out the conference as well.
Oh, we forgot to say that.
I put the link in. So if you're still with us, the link is there.
Don't forget to check out the conference 21st to 23rd of June, virtual WCDC. And you're all very welcome, and we hope you'll be able to join us.
Bye, everyone.